ready to start.
The good thing about it is
All right.
every week on
Hi, everybody. I'm going to talk to you about something that's very near and dear to my heart, which is the adoption of our son Levi. When we started the process about 8 years ago, we didn't know at that time how involved it was going to be. There was no way to know. I don't think unless you've gone through an adoption in another country, there's just no way anybody can possibly prepare you or understand what it takes to go through that whole process. My goal to adopt started back when I was about 18, 19 years old. I was very, I guess, young and naive, as we all can be when we're 18 or 19. And I had a friend that worked in the deaf community down in Kentucky as a social worker, and she would go out into the hills of Kentucky and try to help parents, of course the majority of which are hearing, help them learn how to raise their deaf children, how to communicate with them, what schools, what different things they can do to make things better. And she was always coming to me and saying how angry she was at these stupid hearing parents. And she did call them that. They were just stupid hearing parents because they didn't know how to communicate with their children, and she could not understand why anybody would have a child and not learn their language. And I thought, no, wait a minute. It's just a language. You know, that's the only problem is they're just using a different language. And she said, yes, they're just using a different language. And I said, well, then you know what? When I'm older, I'm going to adopt a deaf child, but I'm going to learn how to communicate with them first. And that proclamation took us many, many, many years later to actually adopting. My husband and I, when I was younger, had 2 birth children, both hearing. And when the first one was born, I was working on my master's program in children's theater. At the time when I was going to school and very, very pregnant, they knew that when I didn't show up, that day I would be having my child, which is what happened. I didn't show up one day, had my baby, thought I'd have that baby and go right back to my master's program. And that didn't happen because I didn't want to leave my son. I was infatuated with him and just wanted to stay home with him. But again, that decision led me to, wait a minute, I've never stayed home a day in my life. I'd always been a student or working or any number of different things, usually a combination of working and student, and didn't know what to do with just being a mom. So that's when I decided I might as well start that sign language stuff so I could in the future adopt my deaf child that I had proclaimed I was going to have. I started taking sign at Troy Continuing Education with a deaf lady by the name of Kathy Johnston. She has a deaf husband, a son named Tim, who happens to be an instructor here at OCC, and a daughter, Michelle, who is still out in the community to this day. And Kathy was amazing. She was somebody that made sure that we understood deaf culture along with learning sign. So I remained with her for, I think, 2 or 3 years, something like that, and then took the only 2 classes they had at OCC, which was, I believe they called them ASL 1 and 2. There was also a lot of deaf culture and history in those classes, not like the program is formed now. The man's name was John Ray. He worked at Madonna University with the deaf program there, with the deaf students that attended Madonna. And again, I felt like I got a great education from him. At that point, I became pregnant with my second son and started working as a parapro for Bloomfield Hills in their deaf ed program. Now, back in those days, when you started working in the field of deaf ed, it didn't matter if you were certified or not. It didn't matter if you knew anything or not. You had a heartbeat and you were standing upright, you could interpret, which is what they did with me. There were interpreters that were hired into the district, but then there were kids in classes that were going uncovered. And so they would send me in to cover those classes. Luckily, usually those classes were typing A, B, B, B. Or a gym class or a cooking class, something that was not real involved, such as a math or a history or something like that. So I basically got my feet wet doing that. The only reason I can tell you one of my clients' names is because she's proclaimed it to everybody, and she continues to proclaim it, and most people know it already, but that's how I know Angela Catcher, who's also an instructor here. She was one of my first students. And if she did not tell you that, I obviously could not. But she remembers the day that I would walk in the first day, and knowing I shouldn't be interpreting, but I was put in that situation, I stood by the door for a really fast getaway if I were overwhelmed. And she remembers laughing at me because I couldn't have gotten any closer to the door than what I actually was. I had my second son, continued to sign, continued to improve, kind of in a backdoor approach to it. We didn't have the programs that are available to you. I did a lot of socializing with deaf people. I was constantly taking classes. If I felt my finger spelling was weak, which it always is, I would take another finger spelling class somewhere. So I've gone to almost every program. In fact, I have gone to probably every program in the state in this area, along with programs over in Virginia, and just taken classes as I needed to, I guess, plug up a hole in my Swiss cheese education with sign. My husband and I divorced when my youngest son was 5, and I thought that my goal of having a third child, which was going to be my deaf child, my adopted child, I thought that dream was pretty much shattered. I did not expect to remarry. I had never thought I'd be divorced. And when I met my current husband, we were friends for probably a good 5 to 7 years before we ever even became romantically involved. He always knew that my goal, my dream, was to still have a third child. I was hoping for a son because I'd already been given 2 sons, figured I'm a boy mom, I'm good to go, let's stay with sons. And after we got married, he agreed that we should adopt. And since I had already, in my own naive little way, proclaimed for years I was going to adopt a deaf child, he agreed that that's what we should do. So we started the paperwork. The paperwork for adoption, whether it's in country or out of country, can be overwhelming. When you're out of country, you're dealing with all of the government papers. You have to be fingerprinted by your city, your state. I think everyone known to mankind wants your fingerprints, and they want to know what kind of a person you are. You have people coming to watch how you parent your child, how you react to each other, how you treat your dog. Is your house clean? Is it messy enough that you're not obsessive compulsive? Is it too dirty that it wouldn't be a good environment for a child? They look at everything. They truly do. We filled out paperwork on a little boy that I found online that we were going to adopt. He was profoundly deaf, at least that's what they thought. He was, at the time when we started the paperwork, I believe he was 4.5 years old. He had one of the syndromes, which you'll know about, and he had blue eyes. As an Asian child, he had blue eyes, and he was profoundly deaf, so he had ushers. And we were going to name him Dylan. That's not the child we brought home, obviously, because we don't have a Dylan at our house. But that is who we started our process with. We went with an organization that is based out of Kentucky. When we went to travel to China, it was at the beginning of December 2005. And our group was a very small travel group. Usually travel groups, when you go to adopt, from what I've seen anyways, are usually groups of about, 20 to 40 bodies that go together from an agency, and they all adopt, and they kind of go through the country together, fly there together, leave there together, all of that. Our group was a very small group. There were only, I believe there were 6 or 7 couples. One family brought their 3-year-old child, who was a hearing child, and another family brought a couple of their kids with them. But everybody in that group was adopting a special needs child. Some children were missing limbs. I know for a fact that one had a heart condition. There were children that had eye problems. It was pretty much across the board, a lot of different disabilities. We got to know each other through email prior to leaving, and we had to have phone conferences before we went, because right about that time when we were going, there was a huge flu scare going through, and also there was bombing happening where they were threatening to bomb the White Swan Hotel, which is the hotel that everybody uses when they adopt in China, it seems like. The majority of people, you get your child, and as you're making your way through the country and getting ready to leave, the majority of families have stayed at the White Swan. So we were booked at the White Swan, and immediately when all of this happened, they had to change a lot of our different flight arrangements and travel arrangements to work around staying at that hotel. So we were a little nervous going, but it goes back to we had our faith in God, and that this was when we were supposed to go and how we were supposed to go. So we got on the plane, and it was right at the time when my older two sons were going to be home for their Christmas break, because they were getting a longer break. So they were home, and we took off to go to China. Really long flight. A lot of people sleep. A lot of people take some kind of a sedative, I think, and they sleep. It was a very, very long flight. I, on the other hand, am not good at flying, and I walked the entire way to China, is what I said, because I literally circled the plane constantly all night, all day. I could not sit down. It was driving me crazy. Part of it was the excitement of finally getting our baby, and part of it is just, I don't fly well. So my husband slept. I hated him, kept looking at him with hatred in my eyes, I'm sure, and I walked to China. Upon arrival, you're taken to a hotel. You just kind of you're spinning out of control. You're very excited. Everything there is totally different. When I've traveled outside of the country before, I felt that it was more of a relaxed, I guess, atmosphere, because I've gone to the Middle East. I went to Bahrain in the Middle East, and even though that language, when you see it on a sign, looks totally different, the majority of times when I was in Bahrain, you still had English along with the Arabic. When we went to China, there wasn't a lot of English, and so you're driving through cities and seeing signs that you have absolutely no idea what they are. The smells are completely different, and there's just this mass of humanity. I've never seen so many people in any other country that I've traveled to where there are so many people riding bikes and walking out on the streets, doesn't matter what time of day or night. And this is what we arrive into. And I'm tired because I've been walking the whole time and helping him wake up as much as I could while we were traveling. So you get to the hotel, and it's before Christmas, and now everything is decorated for Christmas. In the hotels, they had these huge displays set up for the holidays, and they had a really large train set up in this hotel, and I just thought it was so interesting, because Christianity in China is pretty much forbidden, and yet everything's decorated for the Westerners. So it was a very conflicting visual image to have. We were there for the night, and then we got on a smaller plane and flew to Nanjing, which is the larger city that had the orphanage where Dylan was at. Once we arrived there, we were going to see Dylan the next day. When you go in to meet the child that you're going to adopt, you go into a government office, which basically has a couple of couches, maybe a coffee table, a few desks, some official-looking thing on the wall that you can't understand what it says, and usually a couple of people. The man that was sitting behind the desk we assumed was in charge, but we're not sure. We just made that assumption when we arrived. we were lucky because one of the other families that we traveled with to China was also going to Nanjing. And so we still had someone from our travel group that was with us. When we got to the government office, we had to just wait. And you wait there until the orphanage that your child is coming from arrives. And that is where you're going to meet